Unconditional love, complete love, love without conditions. That is what they say a parent has for their baby the moment it's born. But one day, all too often, that baby finds the courage to tell their parents who they are. And that unconditional love, that complete love, that love without conditions, ends. Suddenly they are confronted with the harsh reality of the new reality of their lives. Their new reality is a reality full of loss. Loss of friends, loss of church, loss of health, and for far too many LGBTQ kids, loss of family and loss of life. Sadly for them, home is not always where the heart is.
To let them know that we care for them. Being LGBTQ is not what you are, it is who you are. That's how God created you. And everything God created is good, so therefore you must be good. It's often very difficult because they've been so hurt by churches and so hurt because they've been told that God's going to condemn them, they're going to go to hell, whatever. So when imperfect people tell you you're not going to heaven, they don't know that. Only God can judge. And remember, Pope Francis' statement, who am I to judge? And that's the key here. No church person, no matter who they are, we don't have the right to judge. That's God's right. What we try to do is try to let them know, now wait a minute, you're loved. God created you with your sexual orientation. And that's what we try to let them know, that you're loved by God. Christ welcomed every single person that came to him. Any of those people who claim that they are followers of the teachings of Christ are lying. So these people that claim they're pastors, that they claim they're ministers, they're followers of Christ, no. When they say stuff like that, they're not following teachings of Christ. That's a nerve that hits me when I see some of those with that. LGBTQ is not what they are. It's who they are. And they didn't choose to be that. God created them that way. Anyone who is gay or lesbian will tell you that at a very early age, before they even knew what sex was, they knew that they were attracted somehow to their same sex. They felt it. People who say it's a choice, nobody in their right mind would choose to be gay or lesbian or transgendered. Because what they're choosing, if they chose it, why chose a life where you're going to be ridiculed, where you're going to be berated, where you're going to be rejected, where you actually may end up being beaten or abused or even killed, like Matthew Shepard? Have I received opposition? Absolutely. I've even had parents who have gay children, and they some of my biggest, I can't say they hate me, but they really try to make my life a little miserable if they can. How do you overcome it? You smile. Both films are dealing with awareness. I feel that home is not always where the heart is points out how young people have been hurt by rejection of parents how to help these young people, and especially the kids who are on the street. They're rejected from their homes, they're out on the street, and they're taken advantage of. They're brought into prostitution, they get into drugs, they're abused and used. They become sexual toys for other people, usually adults. And they get into, they have to survive. The thing is that we have to point out that no child should be left without. And especially transgendered is a very special category because it's very difficult for people to understand. This is who they are inside. This is how their mind, their hearts, their souls want to be able to live and not be cast aside or rejected. What would it take to have people make a change of heart? Well, one of the things is to have them realize that an LGBTQ person is no different than they are. They're just like them. They have the same needs, the same wants, the same fears, the same likes. They want to be just like any other person. They want to have a family. They just they don't trust the church. And that's because the church built into them such negativity. And it's a difficult thing, but we keep trying. And that's what we have to do. You can't stop. You got to keep out there and you got to keep giving the message. God loves you. God loves you. We love you. Come. Be a part of the church. Talk to God. Because He listens. The bottom line is coming out is not the end, it's the beginning.
New Alternatives is an organization that serves homeless and at-risk youth, LGBT youth, from all 5 boroughs of New York City. We're based on Christopher Street, and we provide case management, crisis intervention, counseling, hot meals, clothing, and a range of other services. People wanting to join New Alternatives, we accept clients on a walk-in basis at 83 Christopher Street. We also have a website, www.newalternativesnyc.org, or we can be reached by telephone at 718-300-0133. Life on the streets for homeless LGBTQ youth is very dangerous. There's a lot of different stuff that can happen to you out there. I mean, one of the major risk factors is sexual assault. A lot of our young people have been assaulted on the street. Also just other types of violence, homophobic violence in particular, gay bashing. Other risks include getting involved in sex work, either specifically for money or trading sex for a place to stay. Conversion therapy is a psychological treatment that tries to turn people from being LGBT to turning them heterosexual. And it's a very controversial treatment, which is generally accepted by psychological professionals to be ineffective. It just doesn't work, and it puts the person undergoing the therapy under a lot of stress because people in therapy tend to want to please the therapist and to do well and be successful, and so they, suppress their homosexuality. And we know from experience that people who are not able to be out and open about who they are develop a lot of mental health problems, including depression and suicidality, and or drug and alcohol use as they try to kind of drown out their feelings. So conversion therapy definitely should not be allowed, especially for young people, because they're frequently forced into it by their families. One of the young people that I always think of. He came to New York to attend an art college, and he was from a small town, and he in the Deep South. And once he got here, he realized that he was transgender. He had arrived in New York as a woman and realized that he really identified as male while he was here. And when he came out to his family about transitioning, they cut off all their financial support for him, including their support for his education. And since he was living in student housing, that made him homeless, and he couldn't go back to his family. So he was really stuck, and he was psychologically very devastated, thought that his life was over and that without an education he would go nowhere, and he was just a mess. And he came to us, and we first started out by getting him into an LGBT housing program so that he had somewhere safe to sleep. And then we also took him to the hospital to deal with some medical issues he was having. And then we also, through counseling, were able to convince him that life was not over, that he could go back to school as an independent student, and we helped him apply for financial aid, separately from his family. And he applied to 4 or 5 colleges, all really good schools, got into all of them, and wound up attending Hampshire College in Massachusetts, and he graduated from there recently. We had recently a church in Harlem that put on its, the bulletin board in the front of the building that gay people should be stoned. It's unusual for me to come across a client who's really upset and in my office crying, and they'll say something like, and God hates me, or something like that. Really internalized self-hatred that they've picked up from the churches or from their religious traditions. I definitely see, especially young people from the Latino community locally, a lot of Latino families are very religious. And, I've had young people I had one trans woman who, as part of some cleansing religious ceremony, they took all her possessions and burned them. And I've had another young man who was exorcised and splashed with holy water. So there's definitely some strange stuff going on out there, and it contributes. I mean, the religious hatred is definitely one factor why young people get kicked out by their families. I see a lot of young people who have come out and faced a lot of difficulty, but even young people who haven't come out, sometimes the families can tell or suspect even before the young people come out. So problems in the family often start well before the young people come out, and coming out is kind of just the last straw. Coming out to their families is just the beginning and not always easy.
I'm Lisa Morell, and I'm a therapist in Southern California, and my expertise is in working with LGBTQ populations, creating a safe place for a kid to be themselves, to say what's true for them, to even put into words what they've been feeling and experiencing, maybe for the first time with another person, is huge for them. This immediately reduces their isolation and their sense of being alone. Sometimes I'll share a little bit about my story. I don't usually talk about, my personal life too much with my clients, of course, but, it's important as a queer therapist for me to model that and to share the pieces of my story that might be helpful to that kid. So in creating that relationship of support, whether it's me or it's somebody else in their life, that gives them courage to begin to come out more to themselves and to other people. And that reduces shame. That shame breeds in isolation. So a closet is a very, very deadly place. Most parents make assumptions about their child's heterosexual identity or their conformity to the gender roles that are normative in their culture. And so when their child varies from that narrative, the parent is often caught in a position much like the mother of the ugly duckling, where they're caught between their love and desire to protect their child and the social pressure they feel to socialize their child according to the norms of their culture. So for a parent to develop that unconditional love for that child, they have to face their own fears and come to terms with their own assumptions and expectations. And first of all, there aren't many resources for homeless youth that are specific to queer kids. So being on the streets is bad enough, and it's unsafe enough. But all of the dangers and risks that homeless youth face are doubled for queer youth. So the risk of drug abuse, the risk of violence, the risk of sexual assault, the risk of being murdered, all double statistically when youth are queer. The queerer they are, the more gender nonconforming they are, the more at risk they are. When they're youth of color, racial minorities, they have exponential risk because of multiple minority status. Queer or trans women of color are going to be at the greatest risk. So you're talking about the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. And services are generally rendered in a way that is organized around the gender binary. And when I vet a resource and I ask them about their ability to serve queer youth, or can you house a trans man, they'll kind of stammer and stutter and say, well, we like everybody, or I have gay friends, or something like that. So there's really this lack of understanding about the disparate needs and the unique needs of queer youth in terms of housing and so forth, and a conflation of sexuality and gender, that somehow there aren't differences between what, say, a gay male needs in terms of culturally competent support and a trans male. So there's a disconnect in that regard. And as I was saying before, in terms of affirmative therapy, queer people are, like any minority, are kind of hypervigilant about safety and about being accepted and understood. Conversion therapy, reparative therapy, sexual orientation change efforts, that's kind of the language attached to that. These are therapies that are rooted in the premise that you can change sexual orientation or gender identity using techniques that historically have ranged from, electroshock therapy, aversion techniques, shaming, humiliation, physical pain, emotional pain, to create an aversive reaction to what is the natural either attraction or identity expression for a queer person. And every major mental health and medical organization condemns these therapies as both ineffective, unethical, and causing harm. It's well documented that people who have received these services have a higher rate of suicide, higher rate of depression. And the reason is, besides the fact that there are these really horrific kinds of interventions historically, is that they play on the internalized shame and self-loathing that's central to homophobia and biphobia and transphobia. And they're rooted in eradicating what for a queer person comes completely naturally by means of shame and fear and humiliation. So they're very, very harmful and believed to be unethical. And we've succeeded in outlawing the practice on minors in California and New Jersey. There's something pending in New York, but the folks who practice this are really pushing back and trying to maintain the practice. Well, some are more overt than others. Some are more subtle than others. So one of the examples that is given. It is an aversion technique in which either electroshock or something aversive like a nauseating smell or thought will be paired with looking at pictures of, let's say, somebody of the same sex, in order to create an aversive reaction to that image. And there's also they like to reframe this now and talk about, instead of talking about eradicating homosexual tendencies, they talk about maximizing your heterosexual potential. My own coming out process, which made me very aware of how much I didn't know that I didn't know. And that was tremendously impactful, not only in my personal development, but also in how I looked at sexuality and relationships and gender in my practice with my clients. And it became really apparent to me how invisible our culture was. When I came out, I really felt like a refugee, and I didn't have connections to the community, and that really shaped my experience. And in terms of the professional world, it was really clear that there weren't many people who were intentionally practicing in a way that let queer people know that they would be safe. So I really shifted my practice and did a lot of education and research and consulting to learn what I hadn't learned in graduate school, because affirmative therapy or cultural competency with LGBT folks wasn't part of my training. And that's part of the problem. There's an assumption that is kind of there throughout a lot of theory and a lot of professional training for clinicians that assumes heterosexuality or ignores the issue of sexuality and gender identity. And so I did a lot of my own personal research and education and consulting to kind of go back and fill in the gaps. And I'm still learning.